All right. Good morning. Can we show some love to the band? Show some love to the band. I actually just asked if they're down to stay up here with me, but they said no, so they're going to go grab their seat. Can we give it up one more time for Teacher Kayla and her helpers and the amazing kiddos in the house? Nice work, kids. Well, hey, if we have not yet had a chance to meet, my name is Royce, one of the pastors here, and what a privilege, what an honor it is to spend Easter Sunday together. Thanks so much for gracing us with your presence. I hope you can be blessed and encouraged. I hope have you already been blessed thus far? Okay, good. Well, here's what I want to do. Kayla already preached my sermon, so I'm just going to pray. So if everyone could just bow your heads and pray. No, I'm just playing. I do want to just speak to you briefly. Hopefully an encouraging Easter message. And I do want to build off of this idea of God's power. Somebody say, God's power. I want to talk about the power of God. And obviously we come to spaces and places like this on Easter Sunday because we believe, or perhaps you don't believe, but you're still here and that's cool too, that God's power raised Jesus from the dead. And that's an awesome thing, right? You ever been in church where the pastor's like, he is risen? And then what are y'all supposed to say? He is risen. Is that how it is? Indeed, he is risen indeed. I think it's just he is risen indeed. He is risen. He is risen indeed. That's awesome. That's incredible. That's amazing. Churches sometimes refer to Easter as the Super Bowl of the church. It's like the crux of the church, right? We base our faith on this belief, this conviction that Jesus is alive, that Jesus is risen. But what does that mean, though, for us, right? Like, the older and older that I get, and I preach so many sermons over my preaching career, pastor career. But sometimes you get to Sundays like this and you're preparing a message and you say things like he is risen, but it feels a little cliche. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Like sometimes I've been a Christian for a long time, but sometimes I have to remind myself, well, what does that even mean? And like, what are the actual implications for our lives? Because if we just come up in here and sing some songs, that's cool and it feels good in the moment, but how does that actually affect your Monday and your Tuesday and your Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday? And so I want to talk again about the power of God, but I want to do so from a particular lens. And here's my sermon title, if you will. Turn to your neighbor right now and say, power for the powerless. Power for the powerless. I want to talk about this notion and this idea of God's power being for, in particular, the powerless. And to help guide our conversation, I want to read from another account of the Easter story from Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Kayla read from the Gospel of Mark, and how many know there's 4 Gospels in the Bible? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and each of these gospel writers speak to the resurrection story from a different perspective, a different lens, a different emphasis. And so collectively, it's a beautiful thing to read multiple translations and multiple versions because then you get to see a bigger picture of the story. So I want to just read another version of the story from the Gospel of Matthew. So if you have your Bibles, you could turn there. Otherwise, we have the amazing big Bible up on the screen. Shout out to Stephen, by the way, who's running the Bible today. Stephen, what's up? Love you. And our AV team up top, Oscar and Victor. Make some noise. Give it up for yourselves as well. Thanks for being here. While we're at it, in our video crew, the one-man crew, Austin. Matthew chapter 28, verse 1. I just want to read 10 verses for us, and then we'll talk for a little bit. It says, after the Sabbath, where's Kyrie at? After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, somebody say Mary. Y'all remember Mary? Mary went to look at the tomb. And there was a violent earthquake. Everybody do this real quick. There was a violent earthquake. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, he rolled back the stone and he sat on it, just like Teacher Kayla did. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook. Shake your neighbor real quick. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Only if you know them. Consent, please. They shook and became like dead men. Verse 5, the angel said to the woman, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen. Just as he said, come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. And there you will see him. Now I have told you. Verse 8. So the woman hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy. Have you ever felt multiple emotions at the same time? They were afraid, yet they were filled with joy. And they ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers, go to Galilee. There they will see me. Again, I want to speak to you for just a few moments from this idea, this topic, power for the powerless. Power for the powerless. Have you ever felt powerless? Do you know the sensation, the feeling, the emotion? Right? This inability, unable to control or influence the particularities of the circumstance or situation or events or outcomes that you find yourself in. Right? There's nothing worse than feeling powerless. Right? When it feels like things are spiraling outside of your control. And no matter how hard you try, no matter what you do, it feels like nothing works. And there are moments and times where you feel so powerless that it leads you to feel utter despair and helplessness and hopelessness. Right? We've all at some point have felt this sense of powerlessness. I was just thinking about moments and times in my own life where I felt powerless and helpless and hopeless. And, I didn't really want to talk about this because we've been talking about it for a little bit and we're going to talk about it next Sunday. But even this little trolling situation that we find ourselves in, to be honest, the past couple of weeks, I've felt very powerless at times. Can I just be honest? Like the sheer magnitude of the comments and the words that are being said and the videos and the hundreds and thousands of views. And it feels like we're just so small, but the masses that seem to have come against us are so big. Have you ever had that feeling? Right? Where the forces, the people, the things that are coming against you are so massive that it makes you feel so small. Right? We've all felt powerless at some point or another. Maybe for some of you, you've understood powerlessness because you felt powerless in the face of a diagnosis. An illness, a sickness. When you see your loved one on the hospital bed and you wish you could do something, but the doctors say nothing could be done. Powerlessness, right? Maybe you felt powerlessness in the face of a financial crisis where the bills keep stacking up and the debt just keeps getting bigger. And no matter how hard you try, it just feels like there's nothing you could do. Powerlessness. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a marriage, and no matter how hard you try, it feels like there's nothing that you can do to save this relationship. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe it's depression. Maybe it's an addiction. No matter how hard you try to break this addiction, you just can't break free. Or maybe some of you know the sense of powerlessness because you've got called into your boss's office or HR, and you get seated at a table in a chair, and your manager, the HR, tells you, today's your last day. Pack up your stuff, and you got to go. Powerlessness. Maybe some of you understand powerlessness because you understand what it feels like to go against a system and an institution that has been constructed and designed to silence and oppress you simply because of the color of your skin or your gender identity or your sexual orientation or your mental or physical ability or because you don't have a lot of money. We all understand powerlessness. But can I suggest, if there's anybody that understood this sense of powerlessness, I think it was these disciples some 2,000 years ago on that first Easter Sunday. In particular, the women disciples, the Mary and Mary. Right? Can you imagine, just for a moment, put yourselves, close your eyes if you need to, consider yourselves one of the disciples. Right? Just a few days ago, that your best friend, the supposed Messiah, the Savior of the world, the one that you left everything, you left family, you left friends, you left job, and you signed up to follow Jesus, and you thought he was the one that was going to save you, your people, and the world, and all of a sudden you see him go on trial, get whipped, beaten, spitting upon, and laughed at, with the crown of thorns pressed upon his brow, and he walks his own cross up to Calvary, and then he's nailed to a cross to die in front of the world to see. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to be a disciple in those days? You want to talk about powerlessness? Well, I think they probably felt pretty powerless. And then think about this. To be one of the women disciples. You understand that in Jesus' day, it was a highly patriarchal society and culture. So to be a woman was to be relegated to the bottom of the social pole. In fact, you had no power. Did you realize that in Jesus' day, a woman couldn't even testify in the court of law? And then when it comes to religiosity, when it comes to Jewish piety, do you realize that women were relegated to just be spectators in the synagogue? They couldn't come into spaces like this and actually preach or pray. They had to be spectators. And when it came to the temple, do you realize that there were particular areas of the temple in which they were relegated to? So imagine being one of these women disciples. Not only do they find themselves in an utter state of powerlessness and despair and grief and sadness and confusion, but they also understand what it means to be powerless within a society. And then to add to that, on this first Easter Sunday some 2,000 years ago, imagine what it must have felt like to hold all those different emotions and then to be attached to Jesus, public enemy number one. So you can imagine as they find their way to the tomb that Easter Sunday, I would suggest that if anybody understood what it felt like to feel powerless, it was them. But I know this sounds sad. You're like, I came to Easter to be encouraged. Here's the encouragement, church. What I love about the story is while they show up to the tomb feeling powerless, I want us to see what happens. Look what happens. They get to the tomb, and look what it says in verse 1. It says, after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb. And here's what I want us to see, is that they encounter something. You want to know what they encounter? Teacher Kayla said it earlier. Say it again. The power of God. You know, I love the Gospel of Matthew's account because the Gospel of Matthew wants us to pay attention to the power that is at work on Resurrection Sunday. Look what it says. It says this, they get to the tomb, and all of a sudden, I want us to see this. The power of God shows up. Look what it says in verse 2. It says there was a violent earthquake. Come on, where's my earthquake feet at? There was a violent, have you all ever been in an earthquake? Yo, I'm telling you, there's nothing more powerful than an earthquake. I was in an earthquake, and I was in college at the time, and all of a sudden the desk starts shaking, the whole ground starts moving. Can I suggest, I think what Matthew wants us to understand is that when God shows up, there's some power when God shows up. So God shows up in the form of an angel. There was a violent earthquake, and then it goes on and it says, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, watch this, he rolled back the stone and sat on it. You remember the little drama that we just had? You got to understand, historians think that tomb, you know what the tomb, the stone was for? It was to keep whoever was inside in and whoever's outside out. So most historians think that the stone was probably some 4 to 6 feet in diameter, a couple 1,000 pounds. And yet what does the gospel writer remind us? That the stone has nothing on the power of God. My kids, my boys especially, when they play basketball, they like to do this thing after they score on somebody. They do this thing. You ever seen on NBA, you watching March Madness? That means too small. Can I suggest Angel's like too small? This too small. This stone too small. I'm gonna sit on it. Too small, y'all. Can I suggest? I think Matthew wants us to understand something. That when God shows up on the scene, there's some power in the house. Here's what I need us to know, church. Here's what I want to encourage you in. The disciples, the Mary and Mary, they found themselves in a state of powerlessness. But what Easter reminds us is that it's in the midst of our powerlessness that the power of God shows up. I just need to encourage somebody today, because maybe you came to church and you're like, I feel so powerless. Well, can I encourage you? Easter Sunday reminds us that that's actually a really good place to be. Because I know it sucks and I know it's hard and none of us want to be there. But the Bible tells us that God draws near to the brokenhearted. That God's power is perfected in those who are weak. So if you feel powerless, welcome to the club. And know on Easter Sunday that what we're reminded of is that there's the power of God that shows up in the midst of your powerlessness. Now the story goes on because it gets better. Did you know that? Let me show you what happens. It goes on, and it says this. It says this, verse 4, right? God's powerful. The power of God shows up in the powerlessness of Mary and Mary. And then look what it says in verse 4. The guards, somebody said the guards. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook, and they what? Became like dead men. The Message translation, it says that they couldn't move. They were paralyzed. God didn't kill them, just to be clear, all right? We don't believe in a God who kills people. But the power of God, turn to your neighbor and say this. The power of God will do this sometimes. The power of God has the power to render the powerful powerless. Do I need to say that again? That's good. You know what we're reminded of on Easter Sunday? That the power of God doesn't just show up in the midst of the powerless, but the power of God has the power to render the powerful powerless. You got to understand these guards, right? People think maybe it was a mixture of Roman guards and Jewish guards, but nonetheless, they're guards. And they had some helmets on, right, Kai? Or my guards. They had helmets, they had swords, they had weapons, like they were trained in the infantry. I don't know what you called it back in the day. Nonetheless, what were they for? They were designed to keep people out. Now, some historians think that maybe it's 4 guards. Some people think a guard being 16, so maybe 16. Some historians think that maybe upwards of 30 guards. But what does Scripture tell us? That when God shows up, every single one of those guards, in all of their armor, in all of their training, do you know what the guards represented? The power of the empire. Mm-hmm. We talked about it on Good Friday. What did the power of the empire do? The power of the empire killed Jesus, an innocent man. So the guards represent the empire. The guards represent those who actually exert and utilize their power in ways that actually render the powerless powerless. That's what people in power typically do, right? You look at the news, you look at the media, we see it all the time. When I think about power, I think about the misuse of power, the abuse of power, the hoarding of power, the utilization of power to actually dominate those and to wreak havoc on those without power. But here's what I love about the Easter story, is that when the angels show up, those powers are rendered powerless. Can I just remind us, church, that what we celebrate on Easter is the fact that God's power had the power to raise Jesus from the dead, but there's more to it. That God's power, what we're celebrating, what we're acknowledging, what we're professing and declaring is that the power of God has defeated the powers and the principalities of darkness and sin and evil that continues to wreak havoc on the lives of the powerless. So what we're acknowledging when we show up like this and we sing some songs is that there has been a God and there is a God who's powerful enough to stand up against the forces of evil and darkness and sin that so many of us have felt like we can't come up against. And God says, no, you can't handle it, but I can. And I will render them powerless. I know. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes it feels like evil is still winning. And the systems of injustice and hate and violence continue to wreak havoc on the lives of so many people. But here's what we're declaring as resurrection people. That one day, those powers will crumble. That one day, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. That one day we're going to get to a place when Jesus comes back again in which there will be no more tears and no more pain and no more crying and no more suffering and no injustice. One day, see, this is what it means to be Easter people. This is what it means to gather as a church. We're not here just to sing songs, just to say Jesus is alive, but because Jesus is alive, what we're declaring is that the powers that be will one day crumble and fall, and every single person will actually flourish. That's what we're believing. But until that day, here, and I'm going to bring this to a close. Until that day, here's what I want you to know. While we're waiting for that day to happen, here's the last part. What we see in the story is that God's power doesn't just show up in the midst of powerlessness. God's power doesn't just render the powerful powerless, but here's the best part about it. And Kayla talked about it. Do you realize this? That what we're declaring and celebrating on Easter is that God's power has actually been given to you and I. What we're acknowledging on Easter, church, is God's resurrection power now lives on the inside of you. Did you know that? Paul says this in Romans 8, right? That the same spirit, the same power that rose Jesus from the dead now lives in you. How do we know this? Well, look what happens. Look how the story concludes. Verse 5, it says this. The angel, right after the angels render the powerful powerless and the guards, they're paralyzed. They cannot move. Look what happens. A very stark contrast. It says this in verse 5. The angel said to the woman, do not be afraid. Oh, these guards, they best be afraid. But to the powerless woman, it's a different message. To the powerful, you better be afraid. Your time is coming to an end, but to the powerless, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be afraid. For I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen just as he said, come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. How many know that when you encounter God and God gives you a word, God also gives you the power to do it? God never calls us to do something God's not going to equip us to do. So, have you had friends that have tell you, just don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You don't know. That doesn't really help me. You ever told somebody, hey, don't be afraid? I'm scared of spiders, yo. But just because you tell me don't be afraid of spiders, don't mean I'm not going to be afraid of spiders. But see, the power of God, when God says don't be afraid, here's what I believe is happening in our story. That it's not just a transfer of words, but it's a transfer of power. Because watch what happens next. How do we know? See, when the power of God comes on the guards, they can't move. They're paralyzed. They become like dead men. You remember that, right? But look at the woman. What does it say, verse 8? Watch this. It says what? So the woman, what? Hurried. Did you catch that? The woman hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and they did what? They ran. How do the powerless run? Because these guards couldn't run. They were paralyzed. They were stuck. They tried to get up, but they couldn't. Oh, it's because the power of God filled these women disciples who were the powerless. This is what God does. God doesn't just show up in the midst of our powerlessness. God doesn't just render the powerful powerless, but God actually gives power to the powerless. There's a transfer of power. So they start running, they meet Jesus. Church, can I just encourage you today on this Easter? I'm done, and worship team, you can come back up. Here's what I need you to know. If you've ever felt powerless, and maybe you feel it right now, here's the message of Easter. You don't have to be afraid. Because not only does the power of God show up in the midst of your powerlessness, not only does God render the powerful powerless, but God actually wants to give you some resurrection power. God wants to give you power. To give you power to keep believing. To give you power to keep hoping. To give you power so that you can one day overcome. Come on, the power of God, the Easter story is that God would give you power so you can continue to persevere. You can continue to believe. You can continue to hope. You can continue to fight for freedom and love and liberation. I know it feels like the enemy is strong and the powers against us are so big and enormous, but can I remind you that the power of God lives on the inside of you. You have access to that power. Come on, would you stand to your feet? I want us just to sing this song. We sang it earlier, but I want us just to begin it. Sometimes we don't believe it, but that's why we're here on Easter Sunday. Because maybe you came into church and you didn't really believe that you've got the power of God on the inside of you. But I want to encourage us just to begin to sing it right now. Let's sing, because sometimes when we sing it, we start to believe it. Sometimes it moves from our head to our heart. So would you just sing this song with the worship team? Come on, sing it with them right now.